All right, so you know how much we love to uncover those hidden connections, those surprising ways the past shapes the present. Well, get ready, because this time we're diving into excerpts you sent from Amitav Ghosh's Smoke and Ashes.
Really fascinating stuff.
And I gotta say, that part where he talks about being surrounded by stuff from China, even though we didn't really know China, it really struck a chord with me. You know, like, how often do we actually stop and think about those everyday objects, their origins, and what they say about the world?
It's this idea of silent influence, right? It's not about flags and anthems, but this quiet presence woven into our lives through, like you said, the things we use, the things we see.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when you're a kid and it's like, oh, wow, everything's made in.
You're right. And for Gosh, it goes deeper than just noticing where something's manufactured. He wants us to see these objects as artifacts, like clues. That rug, that teacup, that paperweight, they become tangible links to this whole history.
It's true. I got this blue and white vase, right? Porcelain. Never thought twice about it. But after reading Ghosh, I'm like, wait a minute. What's the story here?
And that's the beauty of this kind of thinking. It's like these objects become doorways,
Yeah.
challenging our assumptions about where things come from, how cultures interact. And speaking of assumptions, gosh, when Ghosh gets into tea in India.
Oh, man, right. You think it's just, here's a beverage moving around the world.
Yeah.
But it's so not that simple.
Not even close. It's this whole power struggle. The West, especially those East India Company folks, they wanted to break China's grip on the tea game.
They were desperate to find a way in.
Exactly. And they saw India as the answer, right? A chance to cultivate their own tea and finally compete. But get this, they're all about free trade on one hand, but on the other.
On the other hand, they're exploiting labor in India to do it, right?
Bingo! It's like, come on, guys, pick a lane. And that hypocrisy, it gets even more intense when you look at what was happening in those opium factories in Bihar.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Ghosh describes this stark contrast, right?
Yeah.
You've got these British agents living it up in their fancy bungalows, surrounded by gardens. And then
And you have the Indian workers facing these really harsh conditions, barely surviving on what they're making.
yeah, and the way Ghosh illustrates it, it's like a microcosm of the whole colonial system. He quotes one of the British guys as saying, like, we've got the best paintings in all of India right here. Meanwhile,
Meanwhile, the people actually creating the wealth, the ones making it all possible, are struggling just to get by.
it's almost like two different worlds occupying the same space.
Right, and Ghosh brings that to life through these vivid descriptions. He talks about the artists hired to paint the factories capturing this strange duality.
Duality, that's a great word for it.
He contrasts this British surveyor, Sherwill, with an Indian artist, Shiva Lal. Sherwill, he's all about the machinery, the grandeur of it all, but Shiva Lal, he's laser focused on the workers, their faces, their movements, the toll it's taking.
It's a powerful reminder that even within these big systems, it's the individual stories, the human experiences that really matter.
And sometimes those individual stories, they become acts of resistance. Look at the opium trade in Malwa in central India. Unlike Bihar, where the East India Company had a stranglehold, Malwa was controlled by Indian rulers and merchants, and they used that control to resist.
It's almost like by holding out against the British for longer, the Maratha kingdoms, they actually inadvertently created this environment in places like Bombay, where an independent merchant class could thrive.
That's an incredible point, and it challenges the usual way we think about colonialism, right? Like, it wasn't always a one-way street.
Right, it shows how even within those power structures, there's always pushback, adaptation, using whatever means necessary to carve out a space for yourself. And, you know, when we talk about navigating these complex systems, the Parsi community in Bombay, they were masters of it.
They were incredibly skilled at navigating not just like the cultural differences, but also all the logistics of this massive trade network, right? Building those relationships with Chinese merchants in Guangzhou, the big hub for foreign trade back then.
Imagine them thriving in those 13 factories, right?
Yeah.
It really makes you rethink that whole image of China as closed off, doesn't it?
Totally. China's been a major player in global trade for centuries. But meanwhile, you've got the British trying to frame their whole opium thing as, well, someone's going to meet that demand, might as well be us.
The old invisible hand of the market argument, right? As if there aren't actual humans making decisions with consequences.
It's classic. And of course, the Chinese weren't fooled. Ghosh talks about Lin Zexu, this official who tried to crack down on opium. He wrote this scathing letter to Queen Victoria herself, calling out the blatant hypocrisy of it all.
It's always inspiring to see someone stand up like that, even when the odds are stacked against them. But what really got me about all this? The American angle. I had no idea how deep they were into this whole thing.
Yeah, it's one of those stories that often gets left out. Ghosh makes it clear American merchants were there from the get-go, shipping opium from all over, competing like crazy with the British.
And when you dig into who these guys were, these Canton graduates, it really messes with that self-made man narrative.
For sure. Ghosh talks about how a lot of them were like younger sons from wealthy families looking to make their own fortune. They were ambitious, no doubt, but their success wasn't just about hard work. They had a huge leg up because of their family, their connections, their money.
It's like, where have we heard that one before?
Right, and some of them even felt conflicted about what they were doing. But that allure of wealth, it's a powerful thing. It makes you wonder how often good intentions go out the window when there's a fortune to be made. And it wasn't just individuals, right? The whole American economy got a boost from this trade. That money, it got reinvested, helped build industries, railroads, it's all connected.
It really makes you wonder, what are the foundations of so much of what we see around us today? But it wasn't just about economics, was it? Ghosh also talks about art, culture, how all of that got caught up in this exchange with China.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just a one-way street. We often focus on the West influencing the East, but Ghosh flips the script. He talks about how obsessed Westerners were with Chinese aesthetics, their gardens, porcelain.
I love that he points out how many of the flowers we just take for granted, like, oh, there's some wisteria, actually came from China. It's like this hidden history of beauty.
It's true. And it wasn't just gardens. Chinese porcelain, furniture, even clothing styles. It was like this craze swept through the West. Ghosh even talks about how Chinese artists in Guangzhou were making copies of famous European paintings to meet the demand.
It's funny how even in the midst of all this tension, there's this other story happening about cultural exchange, fascination, trying to understand something different. But then Ghosh brings us back down to earth with the Battle of Sun Yuanli, a very real, very brutal reminder of the human cost of this whole trade.
And he focuses on the Indian sepoys fighting for the British, which adds this whole other layer to it all. We often hear about the Chinese perspective on the battle, but Ghosh makes us think about these soldiers so far from home, fighting for something that wasn't theirs.
It's heartbreaking when he talks about how the Chinese tried to appeal to them, to their humanity, urging them to switch sides. He realized it wasn't just countries clashing, it was individuals caught in this web of loyalties and impossible choices.
It makes you really confront the brutal realities of colonialism, right? These sepoys, often from marginalized communities themselves, forced into the British Army. Ghosh brings their stories to the forefront, reminds us there are always multiple perspectives to these events. And it reminds us that history is never the whole story, is it? It's always told from a certain view, usually by the folks in charge.
Right, so when we dig deeper, listen to those voices that get drowned out. That's when things get really interesting, even if it's uncomfortable sometimes. And speaking of uncomfortable, gosh, those parallels, Ghosh draws between the opium trade back then and the opioid crisis we're dealing with now, it really makes you think, are we doomed to repeat the worst parts of our past?
Especially when you look at how similar the justifications are. It's like they just dusted off the old playbook, swapped out a few words, and call it a day.
He talks about Purdue Pharma, the OxyContin people, downplaying the addiction risks, claiming they were meeting this huge need for pain relief. It's like listening to a broken record right back to the British saying, oh, we're just giving the Chinese what they want.
And in both cases, the potential profits, they kind of drowned out any concerns about the human cost, didn't they? It shows how easily we can get blinded by the promise of progress, especially when it comes with a dollar sign attached. Ghosh calls it historical amnesia, this tendency to forget the lessons of the past, to convince ourselves, this time it's different, we've got it under control.
Oh, I know, right? It's like we want to believe in this straight line of progress so badly that we miss the patterns, the warning signs staring us right in the face.
Exactly. Take the heroin crisis back in the 70s and 80s. We thought we had moved on, learned our lesson about opioid addiction, but then prescription opioids come along in the 90s, marketed as this safe, less addictive alternative, and we fall for it, hook, line, and sinker.
We wanted that quick fix, that magic pill. So, stepping back, looking at the big picture here, what are some of the most important things we can take away from all of this?
I think one of the biggest ones is the power of these hidden histories, these stories that don't always make it into the textbooks. Ghosh shows how the opium trade is intertwined with everything: capitalism, colonialism, the fight for power and resources.
It's also a powerful reminder that we're all connected, even back then, before globalization as we know it. A decision made on one side of the world, even something as simple as wanting a cup of tea, could have these huge ripple effects, shaping the destinies of people thousands of miles away.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just goods and money moving around, it was ideas, art, cultural practices. Think about those Chinese gardens, the porcelain, all those things that had such a huge influence on the West.
It makes you wonder, what other connections are we missing? What stories are hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered?
And that brings us to the question I think we should all be asking ourselves. How do we balance this desire for progress, for a better future, with the potential for harm, for exploitation? Ghosh's book might be about opium, but it gets at something much bigger.
Right, this tension that's always there between good intentions and unintended consequences. The opium trade shows how easily the pursuit of profit can lead us down a dark path towards addiction, suffering, injustice.
And we see those same patterns today. Look at climate change, technology, the growing gap between the haves and have-nots.
Well,
How do we make sure our progress doesn't come at the cost of human well-being or the health of the planet? It's a tough question with no easy answers.
it takes real effort, doesn't it? Thinking critically, learning from the past, being willing to challenge those in power. We have to be aware of those blind spots, listen to those who are often ignored, and put ethics ahead of short-term gains.
Ghosh's book is a powerful reminder that our actions have consequences, that the past is always present, shaping the world we live in. It's a call to action, a challenge to create a future that reflects our values, our hopes for a more just and sustainable world.
And ultimately, it reminds us that we all have a role to play in writing the next chapter of this story. The choices we make, both big and small, will determine the kind of world we leave behind for those who come after us. So next time you're going about your day, take a moment to look around. Think about those objects, those systems, those hidden connections. You might be surprised by what you discover.